Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. I know many listeners are going to be thrilled to hear from my next guest, a much-loved Australian writer. She has written 10 novels and has a flourishing career as a freelance editor and writing coach. She has helped many writers on their journeys, including yours truly, and still finds the time to churn out wonderful contemporary stories about people and relationships, novels filled with drama and conflict that keep readers turning pages to find out whether love really can conquer all. Her latest novel, Jack and Kate, published in 2018, was a joy to read, a novel that captivated me from the start and had me glued to its pages until the very end. It's my pleasure to welcome Dianne Blacklock to the podcast today. Hi, Di.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you. That's a lovely introduction.
You've described your initial publishing success back in 2000 as a bit of luck, being in the right place at the right time with the kind of story that Australian publishers were ready to buy, the Bridget Jones's Diary type story, but where the heroine was Australian. But you can hardly describe the 9 novels that followed as luck. What is it? What is it, do you think, about your novels that resonates with readers?
Well, like for anybody that develops a readership over time, obviously those readers like my voice, my writerly voice, you know, that speaks to them, my take on things, my sensibility, my characters. I think that people have different tastes, and I absolutely accept that not 100% of people are going to like me, but obviously the ones that do, it's the voice that gels with them. You know, it even comes down to sense of humour, all kinds of things, you know, that are encapsulated in any particular book.
And I guess you could say that you're at the forefront of this rising popularity in contemporary women's stories, and our appetite for them doesn't seem to be waning. More and more titles are appearing on the shelves every year, many of them Australian. Why do you think that is?
Well, I do think Australians want to read about people like themselves. I mean, you know, if you're reading about a woman living in London or in somewhere in the US, that can be interesting in a different way, you know, for different reasons. But when you know, a lot of the comfort reading is that you want to be able to relate to it. And so I think I have seen that change in the time that I have been, since I was first published in 2002. And before that, there was very little about, and there was still a tiny bit of that cultural cringe. That I had friends mention that they found it a little bit strange to read about a suburb that they knew or something, you know, it felt a bit basic or something, you know. That I get so much feedback about how much people love reading about the places down to suburbs, even the streets, even where a McDonald's is located, all these kinds of things in a book. They just love it. It just feels like they're in the story.
Now, Di, for those listeners who haven't read Jack and Kate yet, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
It's a big, grand love story set over a decade, but not a romance in the straightest sense of it. The first part of the book is a romance. It really is boy meets girl. They have a meet cute, which I quite like myself. They fall in love. They have the usual number of obstacles to that love, a certain number of obstacles to getting together. But they end up together and they're happy. But then it follows what happens after that. Jack is a photographer and he travels a lot for his work. They have a child. It's hard to know how much to give. You know, they have a child, and as often happens with women, of course, it has a massive impact on her, and some distance, you know, starts to come between them, and then it's how they deal with that. Yeah. But it's not a spoiler to say in the very first chapter, you know that they're not together, that they've actually been estranged for 4 years, and then the next chapter jumps back to when they did first fall in love. So while you're reading it, you're wondering, okay, so how did they get to that?
Yeah.
How did they get to where they've been completely estranged?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's a wonderful story. And there were many things I loved about this book, but I guess what struck me most about the story was that despite the passage of time, and the book was set in the 80s, many of the themes are still relevant today. Any young woman or man, for that matter, reading this will identify with some of the main areas of conflict in the book. Is this something you specifically had to turn your mind to in the process of writing this story? Were you interested in the idea of a timeless story?
Well, I hope I always am, actually. When you're writing contemporary fiction, it does tend to get peppered a little bit with popular culture references, and I've learned over time to be a little bit careful with that, like not to overload it too much and not to be too specific, because that can date your story. I just think that when you really get to the heart of humans, if you really open up your characters, you're going to find that they are, cross-generational, they don't just exist in one time.
And thinking about Kate's journey in this book and in preparing for this interview, I was reflecting on the choices I made as a professional woman trying to balance my career with having children. And it led me to think about gender equality and the barriers that many women still face in terms of attaining financial and social parity with men. And not to put too fine a point on it, I think, women by and large are, they still make up the majority of primary caregivers for children and the elderly, and they still perform the majority of unpaid care work, still earn less than men when performing the same role. And I wanted to ask you, this is something that you explore in this book, and it's as true today for many women as it was for Kate, in the 80s. But it's also something you address in many of your other books. Is this deliberate?
Oh, yes. I don't hesitate in saying I'm a feminist, and I think it's interesting that you say that about, it's still Kate's journey in the 80s. And I had my children mostly in the 80s. The number 4 was in the 90s, early 90s. And I very much focused on my children. I was lucky enough to be able to stay home with them. I have a different, more complex take on that now, but that's not what this podcast is about, so we'll stick to the point. But I certainly don't regret that I stayed at home with them. But while, my focus was on my children, and when I had sort of left the workforce in the early 80s, I just thought women were really heading somewhere. We were heading to that equality. We were, things were really on the cusp of changing. And it was to my shock. I don't mean that I disappeared down a hole for the years that I had children, but it was before social media and things like that. So although I was, always follow the news and read newspapers and everything else, it was still different to come back into the workforce, to even to be following my sons as they went into the workforce and into the world more, and nothing changed. What's everybody been doing for the last, and I was really quite surprised. And of course it's, it's there in the statistics, women's pay gap still exists, all those things. And so, those things have always been really important to me. And it was a bit depressing to realise that things really didn't move very far for a couple of, I think there's a big shift happening now. I've always been interested in exploring those issues because I'm usually coming from a woman's point of view. That is going to come out. However, I have 4 sons, and I have 3 brothers as well. So I am always mindful too that, hashtag not all men. And I like to create, men that are sensitive and open to, listening to women and so on. Yeah.
This book was set in the 1980s, not so long ago for many, myself included, but it was a time when there were no mobile phones and heaven forbid there was no internet. Communication in the way that we know and experience it today was simply unavailable. Now, do you think that the lack of technology-based communication added to the tension and conflict in your book?
Absolutely. because I had I had the story from a long time ago, and so when I looked at working on it a couple of years ago and bringing it up to a novel, I sort of thought I would update it, and then I thought, no, I can't really update it. One big thing that happens is that, you know, Jack and Kate have difficulty getting in touch with one another at different times, and that just doesn't happen now. So you know, oh, guess what, my phone's not working, I'll go onto a computer and Facebook message somebody. You know, like it's very difficult to stay out of touch with people, you know, or to not be found now. And it does put a different thing on the sorts of tension that you can build up in a story, I think.
Did you find it challenging to write in that space? I mean, you know, I remember what it's like not to have a mobile phone and not to be able to contact people by email. This generation would find it difficult to write in that space because they've never experienced it.
Yes, but I'm not of this generation, so.
I'm glad you said it, not me.
Yeah, I could remember, and a lot of people have appreciated that. It's almost like, oh yes, I remember back then when you made a phone call, or you know, there might have been a message on an answering machine, and that's about it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Luddite. I'm very, very attached to my my current technology, and totally appreciate the benefits that it brings to, you know, everyday life. But I also appreciate that there were, you know, some advantages to not being constantly online, on screen, and available. I think it really stood out to me because I was revisiting a story, like I said, that really stood out to me. And I thought, and so for the same reason as I said, it wouldn't have worked if I tried to update the whole thing. It was a nice place to go to for a while and to continue with that.
Now, Jack and Kate covers a lot of ground. We're in Sydney, and then Melbourne, London, Paris, Ethiopia, Egypt, and then Turkey and Crete, just to top it off. How much research did you have to do for this novel?
There was a lot. Back in the reason that I was able to have so much insight into that Ethiopian part of the story too was that at the time I was really interested in it and gathered a lot of stuff, and that's excuse me, parts that I wrote back then, particularly of the details in the camp and so on. So that was good to still have that, and it was historically, you know, accurate and of the time as well, rather than, it's interesting what happens if you go and you know, if I was to study and look at that period of time and find out those details from this perspective, it would be an historical perspective, because I was interested at the time and looked into all that and developed storylines around that then. I could still use all of that, which was great. And, yeah, so similarly, the different places that were visited were, you have to do a bit of research about what's happening at that time. But it's not too difficult. This is where technology is fantastic, because you can. So although you might only get a historical perspective in some cases, also the fact that we can explore just about anything.
The thing I found equally endearing and frustrating about Jack and Kate, the characters, were their flaws. And it got me thinking about how to write characters, and especially ones who weren't always likeable. Do you find that hard?
Yes. Some of my better readers were very irritated with Kate at first, and I was like, because you get so close to them, I think you forgive them, and I think you know, you're too close as a writer to ever be able to see. That's why you need better readers, and editors and so on, because they will pick this up. And I have had to say the same thing to people who I edit, that, you know, this person isn't very likable, and, you know, it depends on what you want here. I'm actually editing something at the moment where I'm struggling with, you know, is this main character going to grab us? Are people going to be happy to follow her? So that's really important, and it is really important in women's fiction, especially. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be perfect, and I think that that's, you know, that needs to be said. I think characters are, you know, only real if they're flawed, but it's how far it goes over to that way. So my issue in writing it was that I was presenting Kate, you know, and the issues she was going through and the difficulties she was having, and her sort of trying to get people to understand and reacting, you know, largely taking it out on Jack and reacting against him. And I guess I was with her because I knew in her heart what was going on, but I don't think in the early iterations that I put that over as well. So it's good to have those early readers who could say, no, I really want to strangle her, because they all loved Jack. They all fell in love with Jack. So it was like, you couldn't stop giving him a hard time, woman. Don't you realise what you've got, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas I could see where I could also see Jack's flaws, which other people didn't see as quickly, I think. But anyway, I have to accept that also from the reader's point of view, from the editor's point of view, that they're coming at it with fresh eyes, and that's totally valid. And so I had to work at showing a little bit of the inner life of Kate, and to hopefully help people to empathise with some of the difficulties she was having. And I tried to sort of bump up a little bit here and there where perhaps Jack was a bit tone deaf and not really being as supportive as he could be.
Yeah, I mean, look, he is a wonderful character, and it's hard not to love him.
What I think is at the heart of this, and I'm not making excuses where I might have, you know, not made Kate sympathetic enough, but I do think at the heart of it, women give men make a lot more excuses for men. So because Jack is such a, you know, he is a great guy, he is a nice guy, and he does love her and everything else. But, you know, it's like, so that makes him amazing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, you're right.
As soon as she has a few issues, and she has very genuine issues that a lot of women, you know, she's so young.
Exactly. I was about to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, and, you know, she does have the voice of reasons about it. I love her cousin, and she's trying to sort it out. But we don't forgive her. No. And he's a good guy, so you should just, you know, take him. And so, you know, I went as far as I could, but I thought, no, come on, I don't, you know, like, I felt like it was real where she was sitting, and I could relate to some of that, being that age when I had kids. I was a little bit old, not much older than, I was probably around the same age. You know, young, married, having children, but I wasn't cut off from my family and everything else the same way as she is either. So, you know, I think it'd be pretty tough on her.
So I want to ask you about the genesis of this novel. There was quite a hiatus between your last book in 2011 and this new one. Why was that?
Because I stepped back. After I wrote The Best Man, I was feeling quite I was feeling like I'd said everything that I wanted to say, and the ideas weren't just bouncing forward, you know, they weren't just coming to me as they had in the past, you know. I'd always have ideas for the next book before I'd finished the previous one, you know, and I just love, you know, I think when you're writing, as you would probably know, Claudine, that, you know, you're only going to get excited by things that you want to explore yourself. And that's the way that my books have been. Before The Best Man, I actually was a little bit stuck and I didn't know what to write about next. Now, I ended up, really being taken hold of by that story and those characters, and I did enjoy the process, but the lead up to it and coming up with something, because there wasn't some burning thing I wanted to explore and write about. So instead I had to come up with the story. I was under contract, I had to come up with the story. So, and that was a really frightening place to be in, actually. And, as I said, once I got into that story, it was fine and I enjoyed writing it. But I thought, no, I don't want to, but nothing was coming to me for another one. So I said to my publisher before it came out, I said, I want to step back. I don't want to sign another contract. I want to step back. And I had it in the back of my mind for a while to try editing, because I felt like I loved that part of the process, whereas a lot of authors don't. There's a real split with authors. There's the ones that really hate the editing part. They just wish it could, they could write it and never see it again. Whereas I love once I've written it and then I get to play with it more. And then I get feedback, I get some collaboration, and you start to be able to shape and form, and you have a bit of confidence that, it's been accepted, it's making sense as a story, and now I can really mould it and fine-tune it and so on. And so, now I work across a few different publishers and with private clients as well, structural and copy editing and doing the whole range of things.
So thrilled that Jack and Kate finally made it out. It's a self-published book, essentially. Yeah. How did that decision come about?
Well, what I decided was I didn't want to go back onto the treadmill. I was really flattered. I was poached by another publisher. So I was still sort of with my publisher, but just hadn't done anything with them for years. It's not as though we'd cut strings entirely, but another publisher courted me, which was really, really flattering, because I thought after a few years I was off the radar anyway. And she loved Jack and Kate, but she was worried, because everything is marketing now. She was worried that it wouldn't be the book to come back with, to after a gap of time, to almost relaunch me, if you like. Yeah. And I had this other idea, and then I told her about it, and that had captured her imagination, and she just could see it. She could see the cover for it. Like, she was really excited about that one, and that was the one she wanted to come first. And so then we had quite a few meetings, and I started to write some of the chapters of it. And so we were going to do, 2 books, and so we'd be able to follow one after the other very quickly, but she wanted the other one to be first. But I don't know, then it started to be a little bit too prescribed. Then I spoke to somebody at a cocktail party, the industry cocktail party, who had just come back from the UK and had been working there in publishing as Amazon had come into the UK. And she told me what a massive impact that it had on the publishing industry. And she said, this is the time for self-published authors. You can, because my son has continued in that space, in the digital publishing space. And so I had a lot of really good expert advice. Just the circumstances seemed right for me.
Are you working on anything else at the moment?
Other people's manuscripts. I do have that good idea that publisher absolutely loved, and I do really like the idea. It's actually called The Mother Vine, because I am very firm on that title, and it's a multi-generational story of women. And the Mother Vine, it's set in the vineyards up in the Hunter Valley. Mm-hmm. And the Mother Vine, I won't remember it properly, but it's that's what all the grapevines come off, and there's a mother vine, and then, for them to grow independently, you've got to cut that off and let it, take root elsewhere. So it's a wonderful metaphor.
Mm. Now, Di, if listeners wanted to connect with you or to learn more about your books, where can they find you?
Yeah, I have a website, dianneblacklock.com, and I'm on Facebook, and I am occasionally on Twitter and even more occasionally on Instagram.
Brilliant, brilliant. Di, what a privilege it has been to chat to you today about your new novel and other things. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, listeners, to find out how to win a copy of this wonderful novel, head on over to my Facebook or Instagram feed and follow the prompts. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.